Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
This is it, Part 4, the final part of our Deep Dive series. We've been exploring the anti-colonial political and military struggle, really guided by the source material from Shabate.
That's right, focusing entirely on the details within that source.
And if you're just jumping in now, please, we really do suggest going back. Catch up on the first 3 parts.
Yeah, they provide essential context, all drawn from the same Shabate source. You'll get the background, the factions, the military side.
Exactly. It'll really help make sense of what we're digging into today. Because today, in this final segment, still working from that Shabate source, we're zeroing in on something really critical. And, well, often quite fraught, as the source makes clear. It's the attempts at negotiation. Peace talks.
Yeah, what actually happened when they tried to talk?
What were the approaches? What were the obstacles?
That's our mission for this deep dive. Guided entirely by the narrative and the details in this Shabate source, we're going to meticulously unpack the specifics. We'll look at the various peace initiatives, the talks that happened, examine the stated positions, the strategies involved, primarily the EPLF and the Dergue regime, as they're presented in this source material.
And ultimately, try to understand why, according to this particular account from Shabate, these, well, numerous attempts at dialogue either succeeded or, more often, failed.
Failed to lead to a breakthrough, yeah.
And just to repeat, like we said in the other parts, everything we discuss, it comes directly from the provided source material from Shabate.
Absolutely. No outside info, no taking sides.
We're just acting as guides, helping you navigate the key points, the arguments, the specific story being told within that text about these negotiation periods.
Exactly.
Okay, let's dive in. The first major attempt at dialogue described in this Shabate source, the meetings in Berlin. This seems like a really significant starting point in this story of attempted negotiations, marked by shifts, different dynamics right from the get-go, according to the source.
Yes, the source presents these Berlin meetings as sort of the first big instance of direct contact aimed at a peaceful resolution. Initially, as Shabate describes it, these meetings involved the EPLF delegation.
Okay.
Then later on, representatives from the Dergue regime got involved too. And the whole thing was facilitated by the authorities in East Germany.
East Germany. Interesting.
Yeah. And what's really noteworthy, based on the source's account, is how those dynamics changed and how the role of the facilitator, the East Germans, actually shifted even across just these initial meetings.
So not just one meeting, but a series. And the facilitator's role wasn't static.
Exactly.
Walk us through that progression then, as the Shabate source lays it out. How did things, unfold?
Well, the source states a key development happened in the second meeting of this Berlin series.
Okay, the second one.
The German authorities who'd, facilitated the EPLF being there in the first place, they actually changed their stance, different from their opinion in the first meeting.
Changed how?
In this second meeting, they told the EPLF delegation that, hey, a delegation from the Dergue is also here in Berlin.
Oh, okay. Surprise.
And importantly, that the Dergue had assured the Germans they were ready to meet with the EPLF. So this change in posture from the Germans, moving from maybe separate talks to suggesting a joint meeting, that's highlighted by the source.
So the Germans bring the EPLF there, then reveal the Dergue is also present and supposedly willing to meet. Did they just, push them into a room together right then?
Not quite. Not immediately. According to the Shabate source, the EPLF delegation, when they got this news, they put forward a specific idea on how to proceed.
Okay, what was their suggestion?
They said, look, since you, the East German authorities, already know our position.
Right. They presumably discussed already.
Exactly. The EPLF suggested the Germans should first go and get the Dergue delegation's opinion as well. Then, once the Germans knew both sides' positions, they could act as mediators between them. And the stated reason for this, as the Shabate source clearly points out, was pretty strategic.
Which was?
They wanted to find out if the Dergue delegation actually had a new proposal to present.
Because the Germans had claimed they did.
Apparently so. The EPLF, according to the source, wanted to see if there was actual substance, something new, before agreeing to sit down face-to-face.
That seems very sensible. Cautious, maybe.
Yeah.
Check the ground before committing, right? Don't just meet for the sake of meeting.
Exactly. The Shabate source suggests this was the EPLF's way of trying to ensure any direct meeting would actually be productive. based on something tangible from the Dergue, not just, rehashing old arguments.
Makes sense.
So following this logical suggestion from the EPLF, the source says the Germans then explicitly proposed face-to-face talks between the two delegations.
The EPLF agreed to that.
Yes, the EPLF agreed. And that led to the first direct meeting between the EPLF and Dergue delegations there in Berlin.
Right. And this is where, according to the Shabbat source, things took a revealing turn.
Yeah.
What actually happened in that first face-to-face meeting after all that buildup?
The source is pretty blunt about it, quite pointed.
Yeah.
It states unequivocally that, contrary to the assurance the Germans had apparently passed on about the Dergue having a new proposal, the Dergue delegation did not have one.
Nothing. No new proposal. Seriously. After the Germans said they did, and the EPLF agreed to meet specifically because of that.
That's exactly what the Shabbat source claims was the reality of that crucial first direct meeting. No proposal for resolving the conflict.
Wow. So what did they do? Just sit there?
Not quite. Instead, according to the source, the Dergue delegation launched into what's described as a spiel.
A spiel. Okay. About what?
Well, it wasn't about negotiation points for Eritrea. It was about justifying their position. It covered things like Ethiopia's supposed 3,000-year history.
Ah, the historical claims.
Right. Eritrea's place within that history, the Eritrean revolution's role in Haile Selassie's downfall, the Dergue's own program of democratic revolution.
Their domestic agenda, basically.
Yeah, and the supposed gains the Ethiopian people had achieved under that program. It was all very inward-looking, according to the source.
So their opening move in the first direct negotiation meeting, as Shabbat describes it, wasn't a peace plan, but a history lesson and a rundown of their own political achievements.
Precisely. It sounds like justification, not negotiation.
That's how the Shabbat source certainly characterizes it. Focusing on those historical claims, domestic narratives, instead of engaging with the core conflict issues to find a settlement.
And the source details the EPLF response, too.
What do they say?
They apparently countered the Dergue's historical claims directly, called the 3,000-year history myth specious and baseless. They presented their own view of the history, elaborated on what they saw as the just and legitimate struggle of the Eritrean people. The source says they expressed the EPLF's outright rejection of the Dergue's case, and, importantly, they asked again, present a proposal if you have one, still pushing for substance.
Right, so that clarifies the dynamic of that first meeting. EPLF wants substance, Dergue offers history and justification. What about the third meeting mentioned in the Shabbat source? Did things change?
The source reports that in the third meeting, same story. Again, no new or concrete proposal submitted by the Dergue delegation.
Still nothing.
Still nothing. So with the Dergue not putting anything forward, the EPLF delegation then declared its own intention. They said they would present their overall views on the issues, for a peaceful resolution.
So the EPLF decided to move things forward themselves, essentially.
It looks that way, according to the source, trying to establish some kind of basis for discussion, even if it was one-sided initially.
And the Germans? The facilitators? What was their role in this third meeting?
The German representatives, according to Shabbat, did offer something. They presented a 4-point proposal.
Okay, what was that about?
The source describes it in general terms. It dealt with the continuation of the dialogue process itself. How talks might continue.
So, procedural stuff.
Seems like it. A framework for future engagement. They proposed both parties study it. And the meeting ended after they set a date for the next one, the fourth meeting.
Okay, so the Germans are trying to keep the wheels turning, at least on process.
Yeah, trying to keep the process alive, it seems.
Let's move to that fourth meeting then. As detailed in the Shabbat source, this one sounds like a real turning point, leading to a breakdown.
It's definitely presented as pivotal. In that fourth meeting, the EPLF delegation took a decisive step.
Which was?
They handed a memorandum to the East German authorities.
A formal document.
Yes. And according to the source, it did two main things. First, it clarified historical facts from the EPLF perspective, presumably pushing back against the Dergue's narrative again. And second, crucially, it outlined the EPLF's clear, detailed position on how a peaceful solution could actually be achieved.
Okay, so they put their cards on the table, their plan.
Exactly. And having done that, and likely looking back at the lack of real engagement from the Dergue so far, the EPLF delegation then declared something significant.
What?
They said that at this point there was nothing to warrant a meeting with the Dergue delegation.
Basically, we've said our piece, you've offered nothing, so why meet?
That seems to be the gist, yes. They felt their position was clear, and the Dergue hadn't provided any basis for a meaningful bilateral discussion.
But the source mentions they did still meet the Dergue in that fourth meeting, even after saying there was no point.
Yes, that's what Shabate describes. The German representatives, maybe still trying to salvage the process, suggested the EPLF should still hand the memorandum directly to the Dergue delegation.
Okay.
And importantly, they suggested the EPLF should listen to whatever opinion the Dergue might offer in response.
So give them the document, give them one more chance to react substantively.
Seems like it. So a meeting was held between the two delegations for exactly that purpose. Hand over the memo, hear the Dergue's reaction.
And the Dergue's reaction this time. Receiving the EPLF's detailed plan for peace. Was this finally the moment for substance, according to Shabate?
The source paints a very, very different picture. It says when the Dergue delegation made their speech this time, it was delivered with a new and threatening tone.
Threatening. Wow. That's a shift. From history lessons to threats.
A significant shift, as described by the source, yeah. Moving from justification and narrative to explicit threats and intimidation.
How did the EPLF respond to that? To being threatened?
The Shabate source says their response was immediate, resolute. They declared the EPLF would under no circumstance submit to threats and intimidations.
Drawing a line, we won't be bullied.
Clearly, yes.
And the Germans,
Yeah.
the facilitators, still trying to mediate, or did their stance change in this tense atmosphere?
This is where the source reports another striking development. It says the Germans, too, changed their tone.
The Germans also got threatening.
The source presents it as quite significant. Instead of their usual mediating posture, they issued a stark warning to the EPLF.
A warning? About what?
The source quotes them warning that the Dergue, having recently defeated Somalia,
Referencing that conflict.
yes, that the Dergue had made massive military preparations. And they coupled this warning with advice. There would be dire and terrible consequence unless the EPLF changes its stand.
Wow. So the facilitators basically echoed the Dergue's threats, tied it to military power. That doesn't sound like mediation anymore.
It certainly suggests a major shift, as reported by the source, moving from facilitation to, well, applying pressure, almost like an ultimatum based on the military situation.
Based on this account, yeah.
The Germans also said they'd give their opinion on the EPLF memo after studying it and would set a date for the next meeting.
But did that happen?
Well, what the Shabate source presents as the crucial immediate consequence is stated very plainly.
Which is?
A month later, the Dergue started its large-scale offensive.
Oof. So the Berlin meetings, as described by Shabate, they end not with progress, not even process, but with threats, warnings aligning with those threats from the facilitators, and then boom, a major military offensive.
That's the sequence presented.
It really paints a picture, based on this source, of the talks potentially being used by the Dergue maybe as cover or a prelude to military action, rather than a genuine peace effort.
That conclusion is strongly suggested by the narrative in the Shabate source regarding the Berlin meetings, yes. Collapsing under inflexibility and threats, leading back to more intense conflict. And what's also really insightful, according to the Shabate source, is how these Berlin meetings, even though they failed, were immediately sort of picked up and used by various other parties.
Used how?
For their own agendas. The talks themselves became a tool in other political and propaganda battles.
The source says they were used for propaganda. Against who?
Yes, Shabate reports quite directly that many parties took the Berlin meetings as an opportunity to conduct a propaganda campaign against the EPLF.
So actively using the fact the talks happened to attack the EPLF.
That's what the source indicates, yeah. Not just observing, but actively leveraging the talks for negative messaging.
And the source also mentions this was used to stir up trouble within the Eritrean revolution between the different groups.
Specifically, yeah. The source points to exploiting the difference inside the Eritrean revolution, particularly that between the EPLF and ELF.
Ah, the EPLF and the ELF.
Right. The mere fact the EPLF had talked with the Dergue, even unsuccessfully, seems to have been weaponized by others to deepen that rift, create suspicion between the two main Eritrean movements.
Given that context, potential exploitation, internal divisions,
Yeah.
what was the EPLF's own thinking about going into these talks, according to Shabate? Were they aware of this risk?
The Shabate source says that although the EPLF felt it had every right to independently initiate or conduct contact...
As a main party to the conflict, yeah.
Right, but they made a conscious decision. The source says the EPLF decided to act in coordination with the ELF.
Interesting. So even though they could have gone alone, They chose to try and coordinate with the ELF. Why? Especially if there were already differences.
The source gives the EPLF's stated reason directly. It was because the EPLF was determined to ensure that these contacts with the Dergue would not be exploited as a pretext for worsening the internal conflict within the Eritrean camp.
Okay. So their motivation, as presented, was to prevent the talks themselves becoming another source of division, aiming for a united front, maybe.
That's the rationale presented by the source, yes. An attempt to mitigate those internal conflict risks.
Okay, so the EPLF wanted coordination to maintain unity. Did the ELF accept that? Did they agree to a joint approach for the Berlin talks?
The source is very clear on this. The EPLF's proposal for a joint and coordinated move was not accepted by the ELF.
So, no. Despite the EPLF's stated effort, the ELF didn't go along with it, according to this account.
Correct.
And how did the ELF interpret the EPLF's participation in the talks, then, according to Shabait?
Well, the source reports the ELF was only too eager to misconstrue the talks as having been prompted by the EPLF weakness.
Weakness. So they didn't see it as move towards peace, but as desperation.
That's the interpretation described in the source,
Yeah.
portraying it negatively, as if the EPLF was forced to the table. And this interpretation was then used, the source says, to intensify the old defamation campaign of EPLF collusion with the enemy.
Wow. So the Berlin talks became fuel for accusations that the EPLF was somehow working with the Dergue, even though they were fighting them.
That's the dynamic described by Shabait. The failed talks were twisted into evidence of collusion by internal rivals.
It sounds like these attempts weren't just about diplomacy, but deeply tangled in internal Eritrean politics and external interference, too. The source mentions the Soviet Union getting involved.
That's right. The Shabait source states the Soviet Union, too, attempted to exploit the Berlin meetings, showing major powers were also trying to influence things.
How did the Soviets try to exploit it, according to the source? What was their angle?
The source points to a couple of things. First, by directing through various means an anti-EPLF propaganda campaign.
So the Soviets were actively trying to discredit the EPLF.
According to this account, yes, using the talks as part of their justification, and the source adds, more importantly, by making numerous approaches and showing favor to the ELF in an effort in winning the organization.
So playing favorites. Trying to undermine the EPLF while cozying up to the ELF.
That's the strategy suggested by the source, a deliberate attempt to shift the balance by favoring the ELF using the Berlin talks as leverage or context for these actions.
So the Berlin talks, beyond just failing for peace, became this focal point for internal rivalries, external maneuvering. What about the Dergue themselves? How did they use the perception of these talks?
Well, the Shabait source says the Dergue went on the propaganda offensive to accompany its large-scale military campaign.
Linking propaganda directly to their military action. A coordinated strategy.
That's how it's presented, yes.
What was the Dergue's main message in this propaganda push, according to Shabait?
They were professing to have made a serious effort for peace and alleging to have been rebuffed by the EPLF.
Playing the victim, basically. We tried, but the EPLF said no.
That's the narrative described by the source, presenting themselves publicly as the reasonable ones seeking peace, while blaming the EPLF for the breakdown.
Positioning themselves as peace seekers, EPLF as obstacles.
Exactly. But the source adds a crucial bit of context about the Dergue's thinking at the time.
Yeah.
It says, confident of quick military victory, the regime, after the Berlin talks, did not consider using peace as a maneuver chip.
Meaning,
according to Shabait, their public talk about peace wasn't genuine at that moment. They thought they could win militarily, so they weren't actually interested in real peace talks. The propaganda was just a tactic, not a real strategy for resolution.
so the talk was just talk, because they thought they had the upper hand militarily?
That's the strong implication from the source, yes. Okay, so after the Berlin talks collapsed and the Dergue launched its offensive, the Shabait source then describes other efforts to get dialogue going. The push for a peaceful solution didn't just vanish.
Right. Tell us about those other initiatives mentioned in the source material. Who else got involved?
The Numeri regime in Sudan comes up as a key player.
Sudan, right.
The source notes that Sudan had actually previously supported the Eritrean cause. It mentions a specific meeting in Freetown, Sierra Leone.
Supported them how?
Well, the source adds the caveat that this earlier support was for a purpose of its own, implying Sudan had its own interests at play.
Okay. Realpolitik.
Pretty much. But then the source says Sudan changed its stance.
Changed from support to?
Instead of support, Sudan offered to mediate and started exerting pressure on the Eritrean revolution to induce it to compromise.
So Sudan shifts from supporter to mediator, but also applying pressure on the Eritreans to compromise.
That's how Shabait describes it. Another layer of external influence, pushing for concessions from the Eritrean side.
So facing this pressure, and with other international parties trying things, what did the EPLF do next, according to the source?
Well, according to Shabait, the EPLF considered these efforts by Sudan and others. They acknowledged the diplomatic activity happening, and more importantly, the source says, they looked back and assessed the experience, the lessons learned from Berlin.
Okay, learning from that failure.
Right. And based on all that, the EPLF took a pretty significant step. On November 23, 1980, they formally issued their referendum proposal.
The referendum proposal. Okay, what was the core idea there? What was it proposing as a path to peace?
The source states it set, in unequivocal terms, its views on a peaceful solution of the Eritrean case.
Unequivocal terms, so not vague. A clear, documented plan.
That's the implication. The EPLF's specific vision for how the conflict could be resolved peacefully. Their framework, their terms, laid out clearly. And Shabait adds that after putting this out, the EPLF continued with unflagging seriousness its intensive political and diplomatic works in search for sincere dialogue.
So despite Berlin's failure, despite the pressure for compromise, despite the war, the EPLF, according to Shabait, is still actively seeking dialogue. And they formalized their position with this referendum proposal.
Yes, that's the consistent picture painted by the source. A continued commitment to finding a peaceful way.
And it wasn't just the EPLF pushing.
No, the source says numerous governments, organizations, even individuals continue to take initiatives for a peaceful solution. There was a broader effort happening.
And the EPLF's reaction to these other external efforts?
Positive, according to Shabait. They gave positive considerations and wholehearted support to these initiatives from others.
Okay, so EPLF puts out its clear proposals, supports other initiatives, but what about the Dergue? Were they interested in any of this at this point?
That's presented as the key blockage. The Shabait source states it very directly, but the Dergue was not interested.
Flat out uninterested.
According to the source, yes, unwilling to engage with these subsequent peace initiatives, even after the EPLF's formal referendum proposal.
Right, which brings us to another quite different phase of attempted talks described in the Shabait source. These were secret.
Yes, secret exploratory meetings, a completely different setup.
And when did these happen? What prompted them?
According to the source from Shabait, this new phase only began after the debacle of the Red Star campaign.
The Red Star campaign, what was that?
Described in the source as a major, large-scale military offensive by the Dergue, which ended in failure. A significant setback for them.
Ah, okay. So after a military defeat, the Dergue signaled willingness to talk again.
That's the timing given by the source, yes. They signaled, through its agents abroad, its willingness to meet with the EPLF.
And they had specific conditions this time for these talks.
They did. The Shabait source says that in making these approaches, the Dergue insisted that the meetings be conducted in secret and without the presence of a third party.
Secret and no mediator. Those were their terms. Non-negotiable.
That's how the source presents the Dergue's preconditions for these exploratory talks, yes.
And the EPLF, they agreed to this. To meet secretly without a third party, even though that contrasts with maybe wanting things more open before.
Yes, the Shabait source confirms it quite plainly. The EPLF agreed.
Okay.
The source doesn't elaborate much on why the EPLF agreed to these restrictive terms, but it confirms they were willing to engage, even under the conditions the Dergue set after that military failure.
And how many of these secret meetings actually happened? Was it just one or two?
No, it was a whole series. The source lists the specific dates, showing it was quite a prolonged effort.
Really? Like when?
The first one listed is August 23, 1982, then November 11, 1982, January 3, 1983, February 18, 1983, a longer session, May 16, 31, 1983, July 19, 1983, December 26, 1983, March 2, 1984. And the last one listed is August 31, 1985.
Wow, that's a lot, spanning over 3 years.
Yes. The source concludes, in all, there were 10 exploratory meetings.
10 meetings, all secret, all without a third party. What were the sticking points? Why didn't they move beyond just exploratory talks, according to Shabait?
The source highlights several fundamental issues that just kept blocking progress.
Like what?
Well, firstly, the secrecy itself. Even though the EPLF agreed to it initially, Shabait says At first, the secrecy of the meetings was the main point of contention.
So it was an issue right from the start for the EPLF.
It seems so. They might have agreed to the condition to get the talks started, but they clearly saw it as a problem for making real progress.
What did the EPLF suggest instead? How do they want to change the format?
They put forward specific proposals, according to the source, 3 main things.
Okay.
1, that the meetings be formally declared, make it public, not secret.
Right. Transparency.
2, that a third party acceptable to both sides participate, bring back a mediator. And 3, that each side submit its own proposal or work paper, get concrete positions on the table.
Substance. Okay, transparency, neutrality, substance. How did the Dergue respond to those ideas?
The source says the Dergue did not present any proposal, but limited itself to repeating its desire of keeping the meeting secret.
So, they just stonewalled. No engagement on the EPLF's proposals, just keep it secret. And still, no proposal from their side.
That's the dynamic presented by Shebate for that initial phase. Secrecy wasn't just a condition, it seemed to be the Dergue's main talking point, hindering any move towards a real agenda.
A major hurdle, then. What about the third-party idea? Did the Dergue ever budge on that?
Well, Shebate says the Dergue at first emphatically rejected the idea, totally against it, matching their initial condition.
But did they stay that way?
The source says they eventually relented slightly. They became willing to consider a third party.
Oh.
Not really, because even when they agreed in principle, they kept insisting on the third party being from those whose views are identical with its own and were thus sure to side with it.
Wait, what? They'd only accept a third party if that party already agreed with them. That's not a neutral mediator, that's an ally.
Exactly. According to Shebate, the Dergue's idea of a third party was one guaranteed to be on their side, which kind of defeats the purpose of impartial mediation, right?
Completely. Did they ever agree on a third party then?
No. The source states flatly, by the time the preliminary talks broke down, agreement had not been reached on the matter. It remained unresolved through all 10 meetings.
Okay, so secrecy was an issue, the third party was an issue. What about the work papers, the proposals? Did either side actually put something concrete forward in these secret talks?
The Shebate source says that yes, the EPLF did. Regarding presenting position papers, the EPLF submitted the points of its referendum proposal.
Referencing back to their 1980 proposal again, the one they'd already published.
Exactly. The source highlights this consistency. The EPLF brought its existing, detailed public position on peace into these secret talks.
Okay, so the EPLF had a clear stance on the table, based on their earlier proposal. How did the Dergue respond? Did they ever table a real proposal?
Well, the source says, although the Dergue, after considerable delay, presented a paper similar in content to its regional autonomy proposal.
Okay, so they did present something eventually, related to regional autonomy.
Yes, but it subsequently declared that the paper did not reflect its final position.
They put a paper down and then immediately said, oh, but that's not our actual position.
That's how Shebate portrays it, like fulfilling the letter of the request, here's a paper, but not the spirit, here's our definite stand.
It sounds like a tactic. Present something, but keep wiggle room. Avoid commitment.
The source explicitly notes this meant that the Dergue had failed to submit a paper incorporating its views. Because if it's not final, it's not really their view, is it? So in this situation, EPLF has a clear proposal. Dergue has a non-final paper. The EPLF, according to the source, insisted that the regime present a definite position.
Just tell us what you actually want, basically.
Yes. Even if it wasn't one of the options in the EPLF's referendum proposal. Just articulate something definite so there's a concrete basis for negotiation. And the Shebate source goes beyond just these points of contention. It also characterizes the Dergue representatives' behavior during these 10 secret meetings.
How does the source describe their conduct, their strategy?
It's quite critical. It says the regime's representatives engaged in a maneuver to buy time as they found it impossible to present a position paper.
A maneuver to buy time, explicitly linking it to their failure to present a real position.
Yes. And to help buy this time, the source notes, they requested and were given a clarification on the EPLF's interpretation of the points in the referendum proposal.
Asking for clarification on the EPLF's proposal. Maybe not to understand it better, but just to fill the time. Avoid tabling their own stuff.
That's certainly the strong implication from Shebate interpreting it as a delaying tactic.
What else?
The source adds they kept taking contradictory stands in formal and informal meetings.
Contradictory stands. So, saying different things at different times makes it hard to pin them down.
Exactly. creates confusion, prevents progress, and maybe most tellingly, they concentrated their efforts on prolonging or pushing the dates of the meetings.
Actively trying to drag the process out, delaying the actual meetings.
That's what the source claims, focusing on extending the timeline, not advancing the substance.
Based on the Shabbat source, then, it really paints this picture of, well, obstruction and delay from the Dergue side throughout these years of secret talks, not genuine engagement.
That is very much the narrative presented by the source regarding the Dergue's conduct in those 10 meetings. Focus on secrecy, avoid neutrality, avoid commitment, use tactics to delay.
It sounds like these talks, despite happening 10 times over 3 years, were just fundamentally stuck. The basic ingredients for negotiation just weren't there from the Dergue side, according to this account. How did it all finally end?
The Shabbat source states that when all the issues pertinent to the preliminary meetings were exhausted.
Meaning the EPLF felt they'd hit a wall.
Seems that way, like they'd explored every angle within that secret format and gotten nowhere. So the EPLF took up the basic question once again. They went back to the core issue.
The core issue of how to actually negotiate properly, not just explore.
Exactly. They repeated their proposal for what real negotiation should look like.
Which was?
That the proper negotiation should start in the form of formally declared meeting with the participation of a mutually agreeable third party.
Ah, the same conditions they'd wanted all along. Formal, declared, mediated.
The very same conditions for transparency, neutrality, formality that the EPLF had consistently advocated for, according to Shabbat.
So after years of secret talks going nowhere, the EPLF basically said, okay, let's do this properly now. What was the Dergue's response to that?
The source says that when this proposal for formal facilitated talks was rejected by the Dergue.
They rejected it again.
Yes. When it was rejected, the preliminary meetings reached a dead end and was terminated.
So the Dergue's refusal to move from secret, unmediated talks to open, facilitated ones was the final straw. That killed the process.
That's presented by the Shabbat source as the specific reason this long series of talks finally ended, yes.
Okay, so while these secret talks were happening internally and ultimately stalling, was anything going on externally? Was international pressure building, or were other peace initiatives popping up?
Yes. The source reports that before the talks had broken dawn, so while they were still technically happening but maybe going nowhere, peace initiatives advanced by other parties multiplied and gained wider support, presenting the Dergue with a new challenge.
A new challenge, meaning more external pressure on the Dergue.
Exactly. Even as the secret dialogue was gridlocked, external calls for peace, mediation offers from the international community were increasing, becoming more prominent.
More governments, more organizations calling for peace.
Yes, that's the context Shabbat provides. It says, on numerous occasions, many governments and organizations called on the Dergue to resolve the issue through peaceful means. Widespread external demand for a negotiated settlement.
How did the Dergue handle this growing external pressure, according to Shabbat? Did they just ignore it?
According to the source, they came up with a specific tactic. It says, to allay the pressure, note the motivation, to relieve the pressure. The Dergue replied that it was already there by meeting with the EPLF, by divulging the preliminary talks which it had insisted should be kept secret and to which it paid lip service.
Hold on. They responded to international calls for peace by revealing the secret talks, the ones they insisted be secret, and presented that as proof they were working for peace.
That's exactly the maneuver described by the source, using the mere existence of these secret, unproductive talks for PR on the international stage.
While simultaneously being obstructive inside those talks, that's quite something.
That's the picture Shabbat paints, presenting the meetings as evidence of their peace efforts to appease critics. The source highlights the contradiction, calling this leak a bone of contention in the preliminary talks itself, given the Dergue's secrecy demands. And it adds, compounding this view, even then, the Dergue did not desist from exploiting the meetings for this purpose, while at the same time denying that it was violating the confidentiality of the talks.
So leaking the secret talks for PR, while denying they were leaking them.
Wow. That's the Dergue's external strategy as depicted by Shabbat. What about internally? Within Ethiopia, how did they use these talks back home? The source says that internally, the Dergue regime, which had previously hyped up its military offensives, calling each one the final solution.
Right, framing them as decisive.
They shifted their domestic messaging. They started to profess interest in peace.
A change of tune for the home audience.
Yes. And this change, according to the source, was directly linked to the secret talks. The regime used the preliminary meetings as an opportune expedient to silence the internal criticism
Criticism from who?
of those who were opposed to the war and those who waited to exploit the failure of the Sixth Offensive.
Ah, okay. So by creating the appearance of peace talks, they could shut down domestic opposition, people tired of the war, or political rivals looking to capitalize on military failures like the Sixth Offensive.
Exactly. It was a way to manage internal dissent, protect their own standing by projecting this image of seeking peace, even if, according to Shabai, the talks themselves were stalled due to their own actions.
A tool for domestic political management.
That's the internal dimension described by the source. And Shabai concludes this point by saying these maneuverings of the regime came to an end only when the EPLF formally disclosed that preliminary talks had taken place but had reached a dead end as a result of the Dergue's obduracy.
So it was the EPLF publicly calling out the failure and blaming the Dergue's inflexibility, obduracy, that stopped the Dergue from using the talks this way.
That's what the source states, yes. The EPLF's disclosure ended the Dergue's ability to exploit the facade of negotiation. But despite all these failures, Berlin, the 10 secret talks as detailed by Shabat, the source consistently emphasizes the EPLF's stated commitment to keep pursuing a peaceful solution.
Right.
The narrative is one of persistent effort from the EPLF side, even facing these setbacks and what the source portrays as bad faith from the Dergue.
So even after the secret talks collapsed because the Dergue wouldn't agree to formal negotiations, the EPLF didn't just give up on the idea of peace, according to this source.
That's what Shabat explicitly states. It says the EPLF's enthusiasm for a just and peaceful political solution has not been dampened by the failure of the preliminary talks.
Their enthusiasm wasn't dampened.
Okay. Suggesting the experience, however frustrating, didn't diminish their stated desire or active effort to find a peaceful path.
What did they do then, after the secret talks ended, to continue this pursuit of peace, according to the source?
Well, the source says that following the end of those talks, the EPLF has been conducting serious and extensive campaigns for a peaceful resolution of the conflict on the international stage.
Shifting focus to international diplomacy, political advocacy,
Yeah.
trying to build global support.
That seems to be the strategic direction indicated, yes, taking their case to the world stage. And the Shabat source also brings in another critical factor around this time, the worsening drought.
Yeah,
It connects the humanitarian crisis directly to the conflict.
right. The drought, that adds another layer of urgency, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How does the source link the drought to the EPLF's message about peace?
Yes, the source notes this period saw a severe drought worsening the misery of the peoples of Eritrea and Ethiopia, a humanitarian catastrophe.
Oh.
And in this context, the EPLF, according to the source, argued that the main problem was not drought but war.
Interesting framing.
And that peace would ultimately aid in the control of future natural calamities. So, they framed the war itself as a root cause or major driver of the humanitarian crisis.
Arguing that peace wasn't just political, but necessary for dealing with the immediate suffering and building resilience against future disasters.
Exactly. Positioning peace as essential for human welfare, survival, stability in the face of environmental crises.
A powerful argument. Did they make any specific proposals tied to the drought?
Yes. According to Shabat, the EPLF directly linked its call for peace to the urgent humanitarian needs. They reiterated its desire for a peaceful solution and called for a ceasefire and the free passage of relief goods.
A ceasefire and free passage for aid. A concrete humanitarian proposal. Was that accepted by the Dergue?
The Shabat source states, quite simply, although this too was rejected by the Dergue.
Rejected again. Even a humanitarian proposal during a drought. The pattern continues according to this source.
Yes. But interestingly, the source adds that despite the Dergue's rejections, the interest shown by governments, organizations, and individuals towards a peaceful solution did not decline, but has steadily increased.
So, even with the Dergue saying no, international interest in finding peace kept growing.
That's what the source indicates. Broader momentum, growing recognition of the need for peace, even if the regime in Addis Ababa remained resistant. The source emphasizes this interest has steadily increased.
Are there any specific examples of these continued external peace efforts mentioned by Shabat after the secret talks?
One example given is the peace initiative undertaken by the Sudanese government and frustrated by the Dergue.
Sudan trying again, but frustrated by the Dergue, blocked again.
Yes, it reinforces that portrayal of the Dergue consistently obstructing even external efforts, according to Shabat.
This pattern throughout the Shabade source material we've covered today consistently presents the Dergue as resistant to meaningful negotiation. Right.
It definitely supports that portrayal across the different attempts described. The source concludes this section by saying, consequently, the EPLF's peace proposal and efforts won wide support in different corners of the globe.
So the EPLF's ideas resonated internationally.
Yes, gained significant support. But the efforts of other parties for peace were more organized and extensive.
Meaning other countries, international bodies, were also really pushing hard, maybe even more systematically.
That seems to be the implication, a combination of the EPLF's efforts finding support and broader, more organized international pressure building as well.
Okay. So wrapping this all up, based on this final part of the Shabade source, what have we seen? We've followed this narrative, right?
Yeah.
Multiple attempts at dialogue,
Mm-hmm.
the fraught Berlin meetings facilitated by East Germany.
Right.
Then that long 3-year series of 10 secret talks started only after a Dergue military failure.
Yep.
We've looked at the positions, the strategies, the conditions laid out by each side as described in this account.
According to Shabade, yes.
And we've seen this consistent failure, documented in the source, to reach any real breakthrough. No agreement even on how to negotiate properly.
This whole final section from Shabade really provides a very clear, very consistent narrative from one particular perspective.
Yeah.
It heavily emphasizes the EPLF's stated desire for a just, peaceful, transparent solution. Clear conditions, neutral involvement.
In contrast that
With its portrayal of the Dergue regime as, well, consistently obstructing, delaying, insisting on bad conditions like secrecy, which they then apparently violated for PR, failing to offer a definite proposal. Using the talks mainly for propaganda, internal politics, buying time, not genuine negotiation.
And the context, Shabade weaves in the military struggle, external pressures, the drought. It all suggests that, at least from the EPLF side as presented here, trying to find a peaceful path remained this constant thread, even when it seemed hopeless.
It really highlights how incredibly difficult, how frustrating attempting negotiation can be when, according to this account, one side just appears unwilling to engage in good faith. And this whole history of attempted talks, as chronicled by Shabade, it raises a really important kind of complex question for you, the listener, to think about.
Okay.
Drawing from these challenges described here. When does the apparent lack of genuine will from one side, the obstruction, the delays, the bad faith tactics described in this source make continuing to try and negotiate just futile, pointless? But then, conversely, in a long, bitter conflict like this, when is persistence the only way? When is that willingness to keep seeking dialogue, keep putting peace terms out there, keep showing up, even when you're repeatedly failed or manipulated? When is that the only path towards any possible future resolution?
That is a tough question. The line between persistence and, well, banging your head against a wall.
It's a very difficult balance, isn't it?
A powerful thought to end on, definitely. Underscores the complexities, the painful choices involved in trying to find peace when the path is so blocked, as illuminated by the events in this Shabade source. So this concludes our 4-part deep dive series, based entirely on the source material from Shabade, exploring the anti-colonial political and military struggle through the narrative presented in that text.
Yeah.
We really hope that navigating these sources with us has been informative, maybe thought-provoking, and given you a deeper understanding of this complex history, guided by the details in the Shabade account.
We've tried to pull out the key points, follow the structure, and present the narrative as it's depicted in that specific source material covering the history, the military side, and today, these crucial negotiation attempts.
And remember, you can always go back and revisit this deep dive, or definitely check out parts 1, 2, and 3 if you missed them. Get the full picture presented in these sources from Shabade.
There's certainly a lot there.
There is. We really appreciate you joining us for this journey through the source material. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive.
Thank you.